Well, good morning, conference. It's a real pleasure to be here. Mearns MP for Gateshead, and it's a particular pleasure to be in the company of the Deputy Mayor of Gateshead, Rachel Mullen. So, Rachel, congratulations. Cheers. And it's particularly pleasing to be here on this historic 100th conference of the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union. It's a real pleasure to be the chair of your parliamentary group and to just help out with the union in terms of liaising with the Parliamentary Labour Party, organising meetings with ministers where necessary, organising meetings with relative regulatory bodies, and making sure that the Bakers Union and its interests and the members of the Bakers Union have a presence in Parliament through us. And before I start, I think it would be remiss of me also not to mention Simeon Andrews. The parliamentary group is supported by Trade Union Support Services, and that was an organisation established by Simeon Andrews and which supports 10 unions in the Trade Union Coordinating Group. And sadly, earlier this year, Simeon, at only the age of 61, was taken from us. And along with a number of colleagues, quite a number of colleagues, we attended his funeral in South London. And I have to say, you know, funerals are awful things, but Simeon's funeral was actually really quite different. It was a celebration of his life and work, and was genuinely an uplifting experience to be there, to see a man's life being sort of crystallised, captured in about an hour. Of people speaking about him and about the funny things in his life, the many, many successes he's had as a campaigner, the work he'd done with the Labour Party and trade union movement. And I actually think that we owe Simeon a huge debt of gratitude, and I'd like you to thank him in the normal way. Well, as we remember last year, because I was speaking from this very, very stage, we had this conference just after the snap election called by the Tory party, by Theresa May, when strong and stable Theresa was going to gain a massive majority in order for us to have this huge majority where she could lead us into the Brexit negotiations. And against all the odds, Jeremy Corbyn, who was on this stage yesterday, defied the odds, and we actually took seats from the Tories and stopped the Conservatives getting an overall majority. But when I spoke from this platform last year, of course, we didn't know at that stage that the Tories were engaged in buying £1 billion worth of Democratic Unionist Party votes in Northern Ireland in order to shore up their weakened parliamentary position. And despite those extra 10 votes going to the Tory party in Parliament, what it's actually led to is a year when the Brexit negotiations, if you can call them that, have bumbled along. I'm not sure if the Brexit negotiations are between the British government and Brussels or between the British cabinet and itself, but you know, those negotiations are bumbling along on so many different levels. And of course, when it comes to a legislative programme, the Tory party are totally straitjacketed. They are not capable of bringing anything important or defining or of any great weight or substance to Parliament. We are engaged in passing possibly important but non-controversial legislation. Last week, we actually had 2 bills passed through that second reading stage. One was a bill to ban the process of the sale of ivory completely in this country and to help to stave off the elimination of elephants as a species. And another one was about the rating and valuation of agricultural nurseries, because HMRC had determined that agricultural nurseries with glass houses should be regarded from a taxation perspective as retail space, which is totally ridiculous. So I actually had to have some primary legislation to tidy that up. And that's the sort of things that Parliament has been doing for the last year. Nothing earth-shattering at all. And the government cannot bring forward anything important. I would go as far as to say, by the way, not only are we dealing with a government who can't legislate, they want to govern but not legislate, but from my perspective, and I've been around in politics, as Ian said before, I was a member of the Young Socialists. It wasn't called Young Labour then, it was called the Labour Party Young Socialists. I've been a member of the Labour Party for 44 years. And I can never remember in my political time a government as grossly incompetent as the one that we have at the moment. And it's on so many levels. Incompetent beyond belief. Almost on a daily basis in Parliament, ministers are summoned because members of Parliament are putting down what's called an urgent question. Now, an urgent question can only be regarded as urgent if the Speaker of the House of Commons deems it to be so. And yet, on a daily and weekly basis, ministers are being brought to the Commons to answer urgent questions, whether it be things about the Windrush scandal, about people being deported from their own country and then not being allowed the right to appeal until after they've been deported, whether it be the Grenfell Tower catastrophe, whether it be the failure of our rail franchises, whether it be a problem in the health service. On a daily basis, almost, urgent questions are being put down and being granted by the Speaker. And across government departments, we are seeing incompetence and the wheels falling off a government who literally just do not know what they are doing. They are so wedded to their ideology of outsourcing, of privatisation, of making sure it's private first, public second. Private gets the profits, public takes the losses. All of those things happening on a daily and weekly basis. In transport, just in the very recent past, we've seen the Southern Rail franchise failing now for over a year, and by any recognition should have had their franchise stripped from them. But Grayling, in his attempts to shore them up, has then blamed industrial action. It took me nearly 6 hours to get here yesterday, by the way, from Newcastle to Southport. And that's quite ironic because in Parliament I also chair the RMT parliamentary group. So that was my members that I was working with on the train yesterday, and a smile on my face for the whole 6 hours with all of those people, because it's not their fault. The Northern Rail franchise failing dramatically. TransPennine failing dramatically. Virgin Trains East Coast failing so badly that Grayling has even had to take them back into public ownership. And by the way, the last time it was in public ownership, before he privatised it again, it made £1 billion of profit for the Treasury. And that's exactly where it should be, in public ownership. And Chris Grayling, the Secretary of State for Transport, I've called him the Secretary of State for a trail of wreckage, because he went to transport from the Ministry of Justice, having previously been at the Ministry for Work and Pensions. And in all of those departments, he's created chaos, and that chaos pertains to this day. In our education service, we've had 3 education secretaries since Michael Gove stood down or was taken out of it, and we have failings across the piece. Sure Start centres closed. Early years education suffering because they've got the funding formula wrong. Primary schools and secondary schools suffering from a funding problem. And the government tell you they've never put more money into schools, and that might be true in a straight financial sense. But let's bear in mind there are hundreds of thousands of pupils more now in the system, so the per pupil funding has been dropping dramatically. That means there aren't enough teachers and enough teaching assistants in our schools. Further education's taken dramatic funding cuts and is struggling to actually serve the adult and teenage population of this country. They've even introduced an apprenticeship levy in order to try and fund apprentices. And what's the apprenticeship levy brought about? It's brought about a reduction of a third in the number of young people starting apprenticeships in the last 12 months. Universities are in significant problems, and the Open University, because of the massive increase in tuition fees, has seen a huge drop-off in student applications amongst the adult learning population. About a third of their applications have gone by the wayside. And in schools, we've seen the fragmentation of our school estate, academies, free schools, university technical colleges, studio schools, all of these things being invented by a government looking for another gimmick rather than a real answer to educate every single one of our students, every single one of our children very effectively. And what we've also seen, though, by the way, because of that fragmentation of that system, is a huge number of youngsters falling by the wayside. We think between 60 and 70,000 youngsters being off-rolled by their schools because they are a threat to the school's overall results system. In local government, we've got the absolute carnage of year-upon-year cuts now for the last 8 years. I mean, if you drive around your own locality, you might have noticed the increase in potholes in the road. Everywhere you go, it's almost the same. Social care struggling dramatically to actually meet with the challenges of our ageing population and people coming out of hospital. Job losses on an industrial scale. Refuse collection services, litter problems, grounds maintenance, libraries, leisure, youth services, all laid waste by a Tory government. And even on the economy, well, we've had to endure all of these cuts. By some magic, these economic geniuses, the masters of capitalism, have managed, despite making all of those cuts, to double the national debt. My goodness, give them a round of applause, people. They're doing a magnificent job managing the economy. And this morning, I actually saw on the BBC a retail analyst, one of these people that tells you what the problems are on the high street, for the first time. A retail analyst actually had the temerity to suggest on the BBC that why our high streets are struggling is not only down to the fact there's been a growth in online shopping, but because there are an awful lot of people out there who've got no disposable income in their pockets. She's actually said the number of people at the bottom end of the wage scale has grown really rather largely, so that there is no disposable income to go into our high streets and into retail. Well, my goodness, what a fantastic revelation at long last being made on the BBC, and yet they have ignored that fact for years and years and years. In another government department, the Ministry of Justice, and we do work with the Ministry of Justice team through the Trade Union Coordinating Group. We've got the PCS represented there with court staff. We've got the Prison Officers Association who are working there. And we've got the Probation Office and court staff all working together through that justice team. And the Ministry of Justice, it's quite clear, is in a real mess. Probation service being privatised and people not getting the rehabilitation that they need. The prison service creaking at the seams, and the court system well behind with everything that it needs to do. The Home Office policing at an all-time low in real terms. Immigration service where it's taking months and months and months beyond that target to actually sort out immigration, asylum and refugee cases. And even the Department for Managing Brexit. Remember the 35 detailed impact assessment dossiers that they were meant to have, which just literally didn't exist. And when they did produce them, it was basically sheafs of paper cuttings from the newspapers about potential impacts, just telling lies to the Commons and to Parliament about what was actually going on. In health, the ambulance service, A&D, creaking at the seams. Social care is a real problem, and mental health is the poor relation and continues to be. And the big scandal child and adolescent mental health services, young people having to wait 18 months for a proper assessment. Well, when you're 14 with a mental health problem, an 18-month wait is a terrifically long time. And young people, by the way, threatening suicide, not being regarded as a significant enough risk for instant intervention until they've actually attempted suicide. Well, what sort of service is that? Jeremy Hunt and the Tory government must be so terribly proud of everything that they're presiding over. And here we are as well, as a bakers union, also having to deal with the fallout of the high street. We've seen organisations like Asda and Sainsbury's talking about merging, coming together. Hopefully that will see the end of Walmart in Britain. But what it also sees is significant pressure on our supply chain providers, and in the baking industry, that is very, very important indeed. So companies like Allied, Hovis, Warburton's, and all the workers within there will be having an awful lot to do. So as you can see from some of those government departments I've been talking about, and there are others, by the way, I could go on for an awful long time about the incompetence of our government. We are dealing with a real mess. And while we strive and strive and strive to get a Labour Party elected as a Labour government, we must never, ever underestimate the size of the problems that a Labour government would have to pick up from day one. It's going to be really tough. So we do have to make sure that while working for a Labour government, we also have to make sure that people understand the gravity of the situation that we are facing. The rich are getting richer at an exponential rate, and the poorer are getting poorer at a great rate indeed. It's going to take an awful lot of work for us. So while we work in Parliament, we'll carry on doing what we can do to lobby, to talk to the organisations, the regulatory services, the health and safety executive and the CMA, etc., about mergers and about health, about bakers' asthma and about heat conditions in work. We are aware of all of those things and working with those bodies and regularly trying to talk to ministers to make sure that those particular problems are sorted out. All I can promise, comrades and colleagues, is that I will keep on trying. I will try and increase the size of the Bakers Union group in Parliament to extend our range and our reach. But comrades, friends, it's a real pleasure to work for you, and I want to continue as long as I possibly can. Thank you very much indeed.